that little blue thing is turning. Here we are live. Welcome to the No Show. My name is Andrea Edwards.
And my name is Joe Augustin, and Tim is on a cruise as we speak right now. We'll talk about him and his wonderful getaways the next show around. But today we have a really packed show with a great number of speakers, great speakers. So I'm going to introduce them and give them an opportunity to say something about themselves one by one. I made the mistake of doing it all at once before, and that was a big mess. So first up, would you welcome the head of Global Customer Programs at DHL Service Logistics, Robert Kirubi.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome, Robert.
Hi, how are you all?
That's awesome to have you here.
Robert Kirubi from Kenya, if you can't tell from my rugby shirt, living in Belgium, working for DHL, as you said there. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, just looking for a great conversation today and something that I'm passionate about, fairly familiar with, but not very technical about it. But I'm looking forward to a good talk today.
And our next guest is someone who has had her name mispronounced by at least 311 MCs. We're going to add one more to this. The sustainability speaker joins us once again, Susanna Hasenoehrl.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me over again. Super pleased to be here today to discuss the key outcomes of Cop26 as far as they are there today. And yeah, Susanna Hasenoehrl, that's the correct pronunciation for all the MCs out there. I work with business leaders and their teams, helping them to embrace sustainability as part of the corporate strategy. That's where it should be, and not in the CSR departments. Excited about this conversation today.
Also joining us, someone who is beautiful on the inside, outside, and creates beautiful things.
Joe, she's not there, so I think we should bring in Marc.
Okay. Oh, well, actually, I was doing an introduction to
there
Marc.
She is. There she is. How are you?
No, beautiful on the inside, beautiful on the outside, and creating beautiful things. Let's welcome Joanne Flinn.
Oh, absolutely superb to be here. Andrea, I have a very intelligent thing. When I'm hearing these sorts of things, I love standing out. And I have a very comfortable chair just behind me to sit down when I'm not on street music. So absolutely brilliant to be here, because I don't know about you guys, but I intend to be alive in 20 years' time. That will put me significantly younger than my mother is presently. I think I have good odds, and I personally would love a planet that is healthy for us human beings.
And not like our background.
I'm a money brain. I big transformation programs, how businesses change, what money has to do with it. And today I'm on for my left brain, I believe. The money brain that's speaking today.
Right brain's welcome too.
Yeah, right brain.
All right.
And as I was saying earlier, beautiful on the inside, beautiful on the outside, and creating wonderful, beautiful things. Our technical director at Engico, climate change risk advisor, Marc Allen, joins us.
Yes, hi everyone. It's really lovely to be here and lovely to see you all. This might be my first live stream event. So I've done plenty of webinars and things, but a live stream feels like, next level pressure, but I'm sure we'll be okay. But yes, I've been in climate change and sustainability since 2007, since before it was cool, arguably, and was in Singapore the last 5 years. Now I'm back in Perth in Western Australia, but advising companies on climate risk and decarbonisation strategies and all of these things.
So there's no way to put this, but you're in for a heavy conversation this time around. Cop26 is just about rounding up, or just rounded up, and we have 6 very interested people on screen. So we're going to get to that conversation in just a while. But the format of this show starts off with Andrea giving us a bit of a download on the news that struck a chord. So this isn't your news broadcast. It's not going to be a general get to everything kind of news, but it's about the news that really struck us. So there is a bit of an agenda here. So let's find out what has got Andrea all busy.
Well, I thought before we even jump into that, it's been a pretty hectic week for all of us. We set up a WhatsApp chat, and we've been sharing the information that we've been reading so that we can keep each other informed of what we've been paying attention to. It's been a bit busy, hasn't it, guys? That WhatsApp chat.
Yeah.
It's been awesome. I love having other people that read as much as I do. So especially Susanna. She's been voracious, let's just say.
That's been my fix this week. Yeah, especially
I
in the
mean,
morning. What happened overnight in Glasgow? Couldn't wait.
It's been amazing. So as we said, we've been focusing on COP26 for the second week, and I think we can all agree that the media has been varied. It's been positive, critical, and downright hopeless. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yeah.
For sure.
There was an article at the start of the week in the Independent that was titled, "We know almost for a fact that COP26 will fail. This is why." And this is where it says, because there is a terrible silent lie being propagated by the British government and the United Nations. They know we have to ban all new fossil fuel investments as a crucial step to have any hope of staying below a 1.5 degrees rise in temperatures. Yet the three key players setting the agenda have refused to table a ban at the conference. And then, of course, today there was a report where the UN Secretary General said the goal of 1.5 was on life support. Not surprising. I think we all know that it definitely has not going to be. It's not being achieved. In fact, the last I saw is that we're at 2.4, but we're going to share some other stuff with you in a while where I think that's in doubt as well. So, how did it leave everyone feeling? Susanna, do you want to start?
Well, yeah, it's a mix of messages that are coming through, very negative ones, but also those of hope. And I think the one big thing that came through was this joint announcement by President Biden and China that they're actually starting to collaborate bilaterally. I didn't quite expect that. Perhaps some people knew that there was more happening behind the scenes than I did. But I certainly look at that as something new and, something. I'm not quite sure what will come out of that. But if the biggest two kind of powers in the world and also the European Union are kind of focused at the right direction, this could lead to something. But obviously, we don't have much time. So we'll need to see how that pans out.
Yeah, I agree with especially with the US-China announcement. Robert, what was your sort of feeling after this week or the last 2 weeks?
Not to be too cynical about it, but a bit like Susanna there, I'm looking for what actually happens after they all get together for 2 weeks like that. We've seen Paris, we've seen other conferences around this topic, and yet here we are again, still talking about, we're going downhill, things are getting worse, we're seeing the effects in the climate or in different parts of the world. I really need to see something physically start to happen, manifest itself out with these big countries. Appreciate what you say about US and China, but again, the Democrats may not be in power in 2 years' time.
No.
What happens then? So everything is sort of done from my perspective, and again, forgive me for being a bit of a cynic, but it's a bit of a show. We need to have these discussions. We need to show the world that we're talking about it at least. But what actually happens in real life is something I'm still waiting for. Let's see what happens now.
Yeah. And you're so right about the US politics. It's such especially in the recent weeks, right? Yeah.
One thing obviously is that there is a bit more continuity on the Chinese side, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's good. That's a good thing in Asia as well. Anna, what was your feelings?
Well, I went into it with the perspective that the business world and the big money in the world is currently supporting a 3.6 degree world, which is an improvement from a 7-degree world, which was where it was at not so long ago. So I'm going like the direction's in the right way. Is it enough yet? No, it's not. So I'm not saying, pop open the final bottle of champagne, but I will say at least some markers have happened. And what is interesting is some of the behind the scenes financial groups are, very gently but very systemically making changes that will shift the way money moves around. Now, whether it's fast enough and big enough, and with how big the black pools of money are, whole different question. But there are groups, like IFRS, which I think anyone listening to here will probably glaze over. But IFRS is the body that globally over the last 20 years has established international accounting standards so that businesses around the world have a common way of reporting money. They've now taken on how do we create a common system for reporting some of these other things, which will help creating some of the norms. Have a lot of problems to be sorted out. But at the beginning of this year, that wasn't a public commitment. That's now a commitment to do with a group of people who, you know, are kind of age, but knowing they're going to be around in 20 years, so do have a vested interest. So I don't see that, to, you know, Robert's point and Susanna's point, you know, this isn't the glamorous bunch putting out there doing yeah. This is the quiet behind the scenes ones that take measured steps. And I see some of those measured steps in the right direction. Whether they're enough until I see another set of reporting and numbers, different matter. But there's signals that are moving closer to where we need to be.
Yeah.
So I go substance, thanks, guys. You know, you've made promises. You put lipstick on, darling. It's beautiful. I look so much better online with lipstick. But I want some substance too.
Nice comparison. All right, Mark.
Yeah, it's funny. Leading into COP26, I was speaking at an event, an actual in-person event, which was a nice change. But I was asked there, am I hopeful that there'll be a successful outcome from COP26? And then I actually said, well, I've been around long enough to remember COP15. So, you know, that was meant to be, I suppose, the next big thing, the thing where Kyoto successor was agreed, etc., and that did not happen. And, you know, COP26, I sort of went into it feeling pretty similar. Some things will happen, some additional commitments will be made, and there is some cool stuff happening, I think, around agreements that have been done outside of the main negotiating area, but the draft text that we saw the other day is okay. It's you know, not particularly I suppose ambitious, I think, at this stage. And what will really be interesting will be what actually happens in the negotiating room over the next 2 days, because typically with every COP we end up with some sort of agreement being hammered out at 4 a.m. on the Monday morning, which is the Sunday night of the last day. So I would be expecting something like that to happen. Given the way things have gone in recent COPs, everything since COP21, a lot of them, vast parts of the negotiating text have just sort of been, oh, we'll do this next year, because it's actually too hard to come to an agreement this year. But look, there has been some positive outcomes, I think. It's just, I suppose, a matter of how we respond to those as well. So, for example, the deforestation agreement, that's all well and good, but there was another one in 2014 that was exactly the same thing, and that didn't really achieve the goals. Similar, you know, US-China, it's a really nice outcome and a bit of a surprise outcome, but they also did one in 2014, which then went into what became the Paris Agreement in 2015. So, yeah, I'll reserve judgment until we actually see some runs on the board and see some actual progress and proper plans, as opposed to long-term commitments.
And changes in policies, right? And regulations, especially.
Correct. Yeah, and that's the thing. So all of these commitments have been made without the, hey, what policy do I actually need to achieve that? That's the bit that's missing. Or what am I going to do? What physically am I going to do? You know, one thing, the 2030 targets do need to be increased in ambition greatly from where they are today. And no doubt, right? And only in the most optimistic scenarios do we get to something below 2 degrees.
I'm actually at the point where I think there's a bit of relanguaging that's necessary, because the phrase ambition has this sense of stretch and optionality. Are you ambitious enough? Are you ambitious? Not ambitious? La 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 la. Lots of people, frankly, you know, people even listening today, you know, a lot of us, we want a comfortable life, and that concept of ambition is not necessarily something that resonates with why our lives should be different. You know, it's an outside there thing. But, you know, speaking of someone who comes from Australia, and sorry, I already admit I'm embarrassed for my country. Yeah, on certain levels. But I remember two years ago, you know, before pre-COVID, you know, when you could actually go travel, I was back home in Australia visiting the family and writing a book actually on business in the form of business unicorns and climate. And I was looking outside, and where I lived, which was fires that were going on in the middle of Australia, in Queensland and New South Wales, were creating climate effects where I was in Tasmania. Now, for those of you who don't know the distances and you look at it on the map, it might not seem a lot, but it's 15 hours driving away.
Mm.
And a very big straight
boat
away.
And a ferry.
And a boat trip. But if you just take it, for anyone who say, is the distance across Europe, it's the distance across, the USA. It was that far away. So when people talk about the fires that we've had this year, it's like 2 years ago, we had that kind of burning across massive, massive parts of the country. It's that kind of lived reality of seeing things going up, and then fires that were happening, nearer to us, because then embers started, and we had, the heat was creating fires near us. And my parents having been through a stage where fires came down through the city and people died. So, active memory in the next generation of, what this could do. And going, this is, when I talk, so I've stopped thinking about it as ambition, which seems like too far away. And too much excuse at the skies, a bunch of people on testosterone trying to prove what heroes they are. And going, actually, as someone who would actually like just a pleasant, civilized life, I don't want to be living through fire. I don't want to be living through water shortages. I don't want to be seeing more people as refugees, because that's just really not a nice world. But if I want a world that's different to that, what are the sorts of decisions that I can make here, now, or influence that could make a difference, so that rather nasty world that I lived through 2 years ago and far too much of the world has lived through since isn't the norm, because that's actually what it is. This is not ambition. This is not cloud cuckoo land. It's really real day-to-day choices that we can make in any of our roles.
Well, the good news is your family properties will be worth more money because everyone's moving down to Tasmania and buying that up, including the wineries. So there's some ambition for you, Joe. How was your week?
Well, I was
Cop26 experience.
Well, I was hearing all the bad news, and I was looking to see what kind of good has happened in the last few years, right? And I think in the area of construction, we've actually maybe not noticed all the good stuff that's been happening there. So, buildings, and I thought more about it as well. It really is about what kind of makes financial sense. It's terrible that the human race is driven by the financial sense of things, but it's made financial sense to make buildings green. And so buildings are green. They're becoming better. I've been working with a few developers here, and they're working on seeding projects that are going to really reduce the carbon output, the carbon footprints of all the new buildings around the globe. So, but because there is money in it, there's something to be said about that, and they've made some great progress. So that's one of the things that I was thinking about. I was also thinking about the challenge when you're trying to say, let's do something that sort of works and let's change it to something else that is different. And the old, I mean, you may know, you may not know that I'm pretty much into cryptocurrency. I know everybody backs off from the screen for a moment there.
Robert is too.
Yeah. Listen, Andrea, could you also switch our privacy on the stream to global? Right now, it's on a friends group only. I'm going to try and share it further if I can. And this thing about the comparison is always about how an environmentally unfriendly Bitcoin is or cryptocurrency is. And I went looking and I found this article, and I don't know, I'm not going to purport that it's absolutely true as well, but there's this thing about comparing traditional finance, the whole machinery of it, versus cryptocurrency. And according to, and this is from Tesla, so who knows how accurate this is, but according to it, traditional banking is some 400 terawatts worse than Bitcoin, which kind of suggests the idea that if we wanted to reconstruct everything and change everything, we would start again and go with cryptocurrency, perhaps, where you could program all the things you need about banking into the actual code itself. But would we do that? Would we stop running all those ATMs? Would we stop having banks with all the computers that run inside it and all the machinery that goes along with that? Even if it was technically a better idea. And that was one of the challenges that I kind of found myself thinking about. Is like, we kind of have a solution. As in, like, I think when crypto goes into much more about proof of stake, for instance, rather than proof of work, we start to have a really interesting argument for going that way instead of traditional. So it was one of those things. I just thought about it and go, like, it's easy for stuff to change when it's convenient and it's useful to a large group of people and when there's money involved. So like the way building design and building has even the production of steel, which I think I'm going to slip into greenwashing here, but I heard a term, responsible steel, right? And
then they'll have green steel, and then they'll have greener still steel.
Yeah, and
green steel is already a thing.
Yeah, but there is progress on green cement, green steel. There is definitely progress. But when you talk about the green buildings, like, putting the trees on the outside of them aren't green buildings. There's a lot more to it than that, and we're a long way off it. I hear your argument on crypto, and I don't get crypto, as you know. But the two things that came out for me are fossil fuels aren't on the table. And growth-based economies aren't on the table. If we really want to tackle it, so like, if I talk about my impression of this last couple of weeks, if we were doing this 20 years ago, that would be good news. But that's not what is required right now. Like, we should have done it 20, 30 years ago. We didn't do it 20, 30 years ago when the alarms were first being raised. So what we have to do now is so dramatic and so enormous, and it's a complete transformation of the entire global economy, the way we live, the way we work, everything. And so for me, when I'm listening to it, it's like these people live in another world, and no one's got the guts to make the choice, right? Yeah, it's not a time for incremental change; it's a time for dramatic change.
I think I agree with you, Andrea. And unfortunately, at this stage of where we are with the situation, I think it's going to take a catastrophic event to happen for people to absolutely change their mindsets. You're right about 20 years ago. This kind of a change is something that happens incrementally, but people all have to be aligned in their mindset about, we are going to do this. And you go through all the change iterations, and people in business, how change manifests itself with a large group of people within an organization. It's painful, it's slow, and it needs leadership. You're right. I think now for people to really get their noses in the right way, it's going to take a catastrophic event to happen for people to go, oh, we really need to do something here. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
So we could have a long conversation around proof of stake and proof of work, but I'll drop you guys an article, because I did pull it out regarding Bitcoin and the Bill Maher interview that you sent through, where he was having a go at Greta, and then he went on to Bitcoin as well, which annoyed me. And there's lots of detail. That's unfortunate, because there's so much information out there that really goes into explaining this, because it is one of the big knocks against Bitcoin about how much energy is used. So I'll drop an article. It's not for today. We can talk about it another time and get you up to speed, Andrea.
Cool.
Yeah, but there's one thing I wanted to ask you guys, and coming from Kenya, Africa, and the developing world, I'd like to get your thoughts on how you felt the developing world was represented at COP26. I saw something last night where a load of journalists from Africa, as an example, couldn't get visas, was too expensive, and nobody would help fund them to get to COP26 to represent their nations. On behalf of, be part of the nations that's being represented, instead of having foreign press talking about Africa. And that disappointed me a little bit, because our voice was never heard there. And then
I think some of the leaders from the Pacific nations and from Africa did some of the best work. They had the best speeches. The guy in the water, was that Barbados?
The lady from Barbados.
I think.
Yeah. I thought that, there were lots of issues about people getting there, being affordability to get there, traveling in COVID, all that sort of stuff. But and then I look at the youth as well, and I think they did a really good job. And that, a lot of people focus on Greta, but what she's done is she's found a group of like-minded thought leaders across the world, all in her age group. And I think they've come tight together, and they're working together beautifully, which is what we need, right? But, yeah, I mean, there was obviously a lot of failures. So there's a lot of talk about the failures as well. But I think people worked out how to be present if they couldn't be present to get their message heard, whether it was heard there. It was certainly heard on the digital channels.
Yeah. I think one of the elements about my cynicism about it all is if they were being serious about all of this, and I'll talk about it from an African perspective, I think there's something about 150 million that's being given to Africa to develop green technologies. That's a drop in the ocean. It really is. It's even less than a drop. And you need to look at that sort of a situation with those developing world holistically. So all the other things that we're chained up to the IMF and Europe and the US with the loans and everything else that goes on about that, if you really want to release the energy to help us do something about this from our perspective, talk about the whole environment around where we're beholden to the Western world, as opposed to just saying, here's 150 million, it's going to come with conditions, and by the way, we're still going to hold you to account for all the other stuff that we've got you under the nail for. So that kind of a discussion and clear plans and actions around addressing that topic, that would show me that there's seriousness behind this and people are actually going to change some structural things to help address this and help developing nations move forward to support the COP26 agenda. I didn't get that sense.
That nicely introduced us into the first topic, which is let's talk about the money, right? Yeah. And it's been a big issue for the last couple of weeks. It's been a big issue right from the start of this, the whole conversation when the COPs first started. So the wealthy world became rich on the back of the developing world, and we've created the issues that are now the issue. And of course, some of the developing countries are now also creating massive emissions, like China and India, just because of the scale and the size. But there's this message that the rich countries have an obligation to pay for the poor countries so that they can move forward and also protect themselves, right? So the whole adaptation argument. They can't afford to protect, the Pacific Islands can't afford to protect themselves from rising seas, and the wealthy countries need to pay for it. And one of the really strong things for me was that message was coming through. They're really pushing back. I felt that they pushed back hard. But I know that you're always going to see it through a different lens. But one of the other speeches, I can't remember, I think Susanna shared, it was the Mexican president calling on the world's richest billionaires and companies to pay for a $1 trillion poverty fund. And he's basically asked them to voluntarily contribute 4% of their fortunes annually to this $1 trillion fund. And the aim is to reverse the global slide from civilization into barbarity. And the barbarity argument is a real argument, and we're seeing it escalating around the world, right? We're going to talk about the carbon offsets later, but there's two things here. Who's going to pay the bill? So billions have been promised. They've never been paid. We've seen millions pledged. We haven't hit billions. We need trillions. And the other thing is reparations, so the damage. So who's going to pay for that? So when they have to build the seawalls to protect the islands or all the other work that needs to be done, who's going to pay that? Who wants to launch that into that? Anna, do you want to chip in?
Okay, so firstly, Robert, I'm with you. I grew up in Nigeria.
Okay.
So, yeah, and my brothers does a lot of work with the African Union in the climate debate. So I have, Mark, to what you're talking about, I get backroom conversations once he's recovered from the pressure of them. So he comes back for Christmas completely burned out, and then by 2-3 weeks later begins to be able to string a sentence together as a human being. They're clearly incredibly intense events. But I look at the money game that's going on right now, and we're in a business going to go very big picture for people, because then it might get down to like, how does this make a difference to the way our businesses operate now? And to things like Robert's question about, well, what about the rest of the world who's carrying a cost that in many cases they weren't responsible for creating? Is they use two expressions, tobacco and asbestos. Mm-hmm. Okay, the business system that we've had for the last 50 years has pretty much said other people carry the cost of the products that we create. So for a long, long time, we used asbestos out of good intentions. It was a good fire retardant, and we discovered it had all sorts of nasty health consequences. Those nasty health consequences killed people. You might see how this is showing up in the climate thing. other people are paying the cost. The asbestos companies made the money. And eventually the system changed so those companies take responsibility and liability. You take tobacco, another industry where lots of people made, I'm sorry if my system's doing weird stuff, it's usually incredibly stable. That businesses made a lot of profit knowing there was a consequence, and lots of us being in the situation of having second-hand past smoke and health consequences. And the reason why I'm bringing these two into the conversation is many of the products that we've used, because I mean, most of us, are in rich developed countries using rich developed product systems, which is really different to if you're a rice farmer who's growing rice, as a small farmer, or you're growing cassava, in Africa, and different sorts of things. I mean, they're very different impacts of what our business and our lifestyle has. And the reality, as much as I hate to think this is the truth of the business lifestyle thing, is we've got toxicity coming out left, right, and center, and we're going to be paying for the health costs, but many other people are. And so my projection from a big picture thing is there'll be more legal cases within country and across country that will be about liability. And it'll be, and I think some of it will be directly to countries, not to countries, but to companies. And so I do quite a lot of work with boards and CXOs around, how do we need to think, and what's the mindset do we need to shift to? And it's a risk, at one level, it's risk management. Very simply, that as leaders, we can't say we don't know anymore. We can't pretend that, we didn't know about this. It's public knowledge. Look, the school children know about it. It's pretty hard for us to act stupid. And we're liable. And frankly, I think there's a whole stack that we should be for. And it's not a comfortable conversation to have, but it's also the reality.
Yeah. Susanna?
Increasingly also in national legislations, this is gaining ground. So, for instance, Australia, out of all places, but also, for instance, Germany have had Supreme Court cases where the Supreme Court has made the decision that it's the duty of the current legislative and also the companies to care for the future generations. And on this basis, for instance, Greenpeace is now suing car companies in Germany that have failed to commit to the non-combustion engines on the grounds of such laws. So I think this is definitely going to increase because of these advances and new, new statements by the Supreme Courts.
Yeah, there was a statement by CocaCola that by 2030, for every bottle that goes out, another bottle will come in. So they're going to make their, the exchange, right? So there's no waste. But between now and 2030, there's going to be a lot more plastic. And I haven't seen anything about a global commitment by all of the plastic producers and FMCG companies to actually clean it up. There's a lot of charities running around, but Nigeria, you mentioned earlier. If you've seen some of the work that Nestle's doing there, some of the destructive work that they're doing there, as well as the waste that's piling up because they don't have any sort of proper recycling program. So sitting here in Phuket, there's all these boats going out to all these islands. A lot of them don't even have people living on them, covered in plastic waste. But these small communities are expected to not only return plastic bottles, but also glass bottles back to the mainland, where they're then shipped up to Bangkok, where they may or may not be recycled, right? So there's just no responsibility, and that to me is the, like every company in the 4% that the Mexican president suggested, that should be an absolute minimum. And don't hide it. Let's just put the money towards it and get it cleaned up, because
it'll be interesting because Carlos Slim is one of the richest men in the world. He's Mexican. It'll be interesting to see if he leads the way.
Yeah,
that's true.
Mark,
I was going to say something that's actually baked into the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the document that was created back in 1992 that governs how we respond to climate change. In that is the central tenet of climate change action, which is common but differentiated responsibility. So it's from back then that the built into it is the concept that we all have a common responsibility. Every country has a common responsibility to do something about climate change and to have a world that we can comfortably live on, right? But that's differentiated because different countries have had different contributions to the problem, and the rich countries have to do more than the developing countries, and the developing countries also need to be recipients of technology finance, adaptation assistance, etc., so that they can be allowed to grow in the same manner, so everyone can sort of grow their GDP. I won't get into the argument yet about whether I think GDP is good, bad, or other, right? But countries should be allowed to develop, but they need to have that enabled in a clean way. And that's baked into not only the UNFCCC as this central sort of philosophy of it, but also into the Paris Agreement. You know, we've got bits of the Paris Agreement that refer explicitly to technology flows, finance flows, and assistance with adaptation, and developing countries getting more assistance from others. And that's where this $100 billion a year comes from. And that was meant to be dispersed through the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund is nowhere near $100 billion. They're using some other metrics now. Developed countries should be, under the Paris Agreement reporting regime, reporting on what these finance flows are, where they've gone, how they've deployed it. But what we see happening is now this conflation, and Australia does this a lot, this conflation between climate finance and climate aid and normal aid, and go, well, our normal aid budgets are also aiding climate flows, so this is it. You know, this is the one bucket you get. You don't get two buckets, right? And you have to deal with that. So you guys have to decide what you think is more important in terms of climate adaptation or I don't know, medicine, food, whatever, right? And it's just it's just one of the ways in which this sort of thing is being morphed into something that suits now again the developed countries, and you know, wanting to get credit for stuff they're already doing, and
that's called
understandably. Well, it is called double counting. Yes, of course it is. And this is part of the disagreement around the negotiating texts.
Yeah.
You know, so developed countries are like, no, we're already giving you money, right? And developing countries are like, no, not that money. We want other money, right? And that causes tension. And this is one of the areas in which there is a lot of tension around negotiation. I did a training course recently for a group of people that were in Timor-Leste, and I explained to them common but differentiated responsibilities. And the first comment, and it came back really quickly, was, oh, that's never going to work. I'm like, yeah, largely true. And that's from the position of a least developed country. They're like, well, why would these developed countries be sort of thinking about giving us anything, right? Or why would they want to take responsibility for history? And it was a really challenging sort of discussion that we had in that training course. And you know, in many ways, they're right. I guess. But,
interesting development also this week with India. So first, everyone gets kind of very excited about, to a degree, about their 2070 carbon neutrality pledge, and perhaps most importantly about their short-term plans. So increase in renewable energy by 2030. But then only a few days later, they come and say, right, but we'll only do this if we get $1 trillion.
Yeah,
correct.
Quite a tactic.
But they're not wrong.
Sure, if it's
helpful.
helpful.
This is it right now. It's a vast negotiation game. You know, like anybody who's ever watched Game of Thrones. You know, I mean, actually, start reading Machiavelli. Awesome book. Awesome books on that. The Prince, brilliant. Very depressing, but very applicable, because it is. It's this hold out. So what we're seeing is that this kind of we'll hold a carrot, but if you don't do this, and then you see countries, frankly, like Australia, who are going, we'll hold out, using the fact that one of the world's biggest mines. We'll hold out because then we can use that as a leverage point. Whoever is the last man standing will inch something more out of it.
Yeah, and in general, Saudi Arabia is just kind of blocking everything, right?
No, yeah. Well, that
Australia
which
and
is
Saudi Arabia
okay. So
together.
yeah.
On some
Yeah,
sort
not
of
only.
thing.
So Robert, I think we're all in agreement that there's basically a lot of rubbish going on, and
Is that a technical term? Is that a technical
yeah,
term?
it's absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm using my big words now. But yeah, I mean, it's bloody ridiculous. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
it's embarrassing. It's
I agree.
when you come from one of the countries whose leaders and business leaders are sort of doing this, it's a disgrace for me personally. But let's move on to energy, because energy is obviously fossil fuels is a big part of it. So let me give you a couple of the highlights of the week. So the first is the fossil fuel industry had the largest delegation at the climate summit, 503 people to be exact. We saw a new report that expects global emissions of carbon dioxide to rebound to pre-pandemic highs, particularly coal use resurgence in China and India. So it's going to push emissions to an all-time high, which is so wonderful. We had reports that you were saying just then, Susanna, Saudi Arabian negotiators are moving to cripple Cop26. There's been some pretty interesting coverage of that. We saw the first Cop26 draft statement. So this is the final statement that will come out in a few weeks. But there's some good news there. They actually did mention fossil fuels in the first paragraph for the very first time in its history. So there we go. It might not be in the final version of it, but it's in the draft. The surprise announcement of the US and China, who are working together to agree on cutting emissions. That's good news. And there's a new alliance that's been established to kill the oil and gas industry. So it's a small group, but I thought that was a pretty promising thing. So, Mark, do you want to kick off with your observations and what was missed? What we achieved in this area?
Yeah. Look, so the climate change issue is really an issue around energy, and I think that's clear. So 73.2% or something of the world's emissions come from the energy system, right? It's either taking a fossil fuel and turning it into electricity and then using that electricity, or using a fossil fuel directly. So that's a really big ship to turn around. So it's, we do have to decarbonize that area. We have to decarbonize all emissions, but these, in many cases, are some of the easier to decarbonize areas, particularly electricity production, because the technology already exists today. And we have to decarbonize pretty swiftly, and actually then get to work trying to figure out how to decarbonize the other areas, the remaining 27%. So look, there is a lot to be done. I don't think that can be underestimated. The IEA did publish their World Energy Outlook just before COP26, and the IEA are pretty clever economists, and they said 2020 emissions from fossil fuel reduced by 2 gigatons to 2 billion tons, which is a pretty big drop, the biggest drop we've ever had. But this coming year, 2021, they expect they will increase, above the zero line again by another 1, which is a net increase of -2 to +1, 3 gigatons. All up, which will be the largest rise in fossil fuel use ever in the history of fossil fuel use. So you're right, there is quite a challenge to turn that around, because for all the talk of green recovery, build back better, all these things, a lot of it's not actually happened in practice, coming out of pandemic, to the extent, of course, that we are coming out of the pandemic. It's actually been just a return to business as usual, because it's cheap, it's easy, and what we need is actually economic support, not a drag on the economy, so to speak. So yeah, it is a challenge. There were some green shoots. I think the mentioning of fossil fuels is something kind of cool, but we've yet to see that get borne out in the actual results, which then becomes sort of this area where I see now the finance industry and investors playing. So you have, a significant number of lenders, for example, putting exclusionary policies on coal in the first instance, and then potentially in oil and gas, certain types of oil and gas, and not lending money to those things. I think that will drive a lot of change. The export credit agencies, some have agreed to stop funding coal in its entirety as well, which is also, I suppose, a welcome thing coming out of this. So I think it's quite bold, I think, for a government to make policy around excluding fossil fuels. I think it's politically a very, very difficult thing to do. So perhaps this now is the role of the private sector and the finance industry and things to make that call on behalf of governments, perhaps, right? Just one thing I will say is interesting. All of the energy companies have obviously set targets for net zero emissions. Only a couple of them have actually combined with that targets to reduce their production. Only two that I can recall, and that's BP and ENI, who are saying in the future they expect to be producing less. And that's actually quite in line with sort of the IEA net zero pathway, which is saying, there's no room for new oil and gas now. There's a declining demand for oil and gas products into the future. And then actually what I did think was kind of cool coming out of COP26, the agreements around electric vehicles. It's missing a lot of the big countries now, the big, automotive producers. However, there's still an argument to say that moving one or two people around in 2 tons of, vehicle is never going to be as efficient as moving a whole bunch of people around in a train or a bus or, on a bicycle or something like that. So these things need to go hand in hand. Obviously, I'm in Australia right now where everyone needs a car. So it just is what it is, I guess, right? And I'm in Perth, which is very big and spread out, and everyone definitely needs a car here.
Mark, I'd really like to ask you a question about, the political dimension here. It sounds to me that you're saying that, phasing out fossil fuel is really too much to ask from any politician. Is that your view, or do you not? Yeah.
I think it's challenging, right? And you have to go no further than actually look at the trouble that the Democrats are getting at trying to get their own policy through their own party, right? And stripping out a lot of the things to do with the energy industry, because in some ways the political class is a little bit beholden to the energy industry, and
more than a little bit.
Yes.
I'm trying to be diplomatic here.
Significantly influenced by people like very important.
And that's why the role of the media is so critical. So I saw an American journalist has been in Scotland, and she can't believe how much the media in the UK and across Europe focuses on the environment compared to back home. And I don't know if you guys, the first week of COP26, there was a bit of coverage in the major news dailies like New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And then as soon as that they had those elections, all of the environment coverage just disappeared off the front pages, right? But, and then of course we know Fox News isn't talking about it. But on the other side, we all have a responsibility to make sure we're educating our community, because until enough of us are aware of the crisis and then vote in the right way, but demand the people that we vote for participate in the right way, I think we're pretty much screwed.
Yeah, I shared this earlier also with some people who asked me, like, what was my biggest takeaway from the week 1 of COP? And to me, it was having 100,000 people on the streets of Glasgow, and also in other cities. I really think this is probably the only way to change. Yeah. For us voting and putting those people and parties into positions of power that will actually enact the necessary changes. I might not quite see those. I mean, some countries are better than others, and the EU is fairly progressive, but then again, gas seems to be slipping into their allowed energy forms again, and becomes kind of green. So that was a big blow to me also this morning when I read the news.
I think the potential.
I think the thing is though. Oh, sorry, Andrea. Please.
No, I was just saying the potential for loopholes around the EU. So they come up as, they're going to set the rules and everybody has to play by their rules. But the potential for loopholes where another country doing the wrong thing can trade with the country doing the right thing and therefore can trade with the EU. So transparency and trust it has to be put into the centre of this whole conversation. And transparency and trust is a huge issue around the world. But yeah, so that's the sort of stuff that really bothers me. And every time I see a photo, I see an old white man who's
you mean from Cop26?
Yeah, no, but all the people talking and
we ain't got any old white men here.
Yeah, all the people talking about the stuff in a way that's not really making an impact.
We're old men, but hey, not white.
But they're all older than 60. Not obviously all of them, but the majority of them, and they're not going to be around to see the impact of this. So.
In terms of images, what struck me also from Glasgow was this one image where I think it was the political leaders during the first couple of days who were in some kind of cathedral in Glasgow, and about 100 people there. And based on a quick look, it's like 98 black suits and 2 ladies.
Yeah, the maleness as well is a big issue, right? Yeah. Yeah. Should we move on to carbon Article 6 or the carbon markets? Because I think this is a really important topic, and for people who don't really know about it, so people people who are really paying attention to the climate crisis are listening out for the Article 8 conclusions. Do any of you guys? I can talk about it, but do any of you guys want to sort of talk about why it matters and also why it's not going to be resolved at this one?
No.
Mark, do you want to take that?
I'll start. So, Article 6 is the area of the Paris Agreement that talks about market-based and non-market-based mechanisms. Don't ask me what a non-market-based mechanism is. It's just, I still don't know, right? But primarily it's about the market-based mechanisms, which is where a country can purchase abatement from another country and do that trade and that flow of verified fungible carbon units that go between the two countries, right? So it's been plagued with a few difficulties. So a similar structure existed under Kyoto Protocol, the clean development mechanism, right? But a lot of the early projects didn't have, the right amount of verification. It was a little bit open to abuse is probably the right word, and the market ended up getting flooded, and there's billions of these things and they're worth about 50 cents each on the CDM
per ton of carbon, right?
Yeah, correct. Thank you. So we have some problems now though when we move into the Paris aligned, what's going to be called sustainable development mechanism units, right? And there's the potential that a lot of these CDM units might not be directly transferable to under Article 6, which means there are now countries who have loads of sort of credits that they want to sell that suddenly find them worthless. So they're pushing to try and get them included, right? And then another area in which there is a lot of discussion, negotiation, is around the concept of corresponding adjustments. So what that means is if you do an emissions reduction project in a country, let's say you do it in Malaysia, right? So emissions get reduced and then they sell that abatement, those emissions get added back on to Malaysia's emissions number, right? Because you've sold the rights to that abatement to another country, or transferred that to another country. So the idea is that's called the corresponding adjustment. You increase that amount back on, so then you don't double count, right? There are some countries who are saying, well, we should also get the benefit of the emissions reduction that we've done, right? So they're digging in around corresponding adjustments. And it's making life really difficult because this is the sort of thing where you need full consensus. And typically in the last two COPs when they've discussed the Paris Agreement rulebook. So and the one in Katowice and the one that was held in Spain but hosted by Chile. The idea was to finalize the rulebook because we're now in the Paris world, right? Because it came into force in 2020, but without the detail. So we have Paris Agreement as a concept, right? And these high-level sort of motherhood statements. So then the rulebook sets the detail. How do we actually implement the Paris Agreement? And it's this Article 6 area that's become the sticking point each time. And they've sort of negotiated. And then the agreement that they've got to is, we'll do this next year, right? Because it's too hard to come to agreement now. And then in between the 2 years, the number of negotiating positions increases again. Then they whittle them down again, and here we go. So there's a lot of thought that perhaps they're not getting there this time again.
And it's just quickly about finalizing high integrity rules. That's
correct.
That's the word that matters, and that's why it's a struggle because it's not currently looking like a lot of integrity is playing out. Right?
Yeah, and you want to make sure the emissions reductions are real and they're verified, and you can generate a unit that means something. It's fungible, etc.
Not double counting.
All of these things. Right.
Yeah, and those negotiations are still happening today in Glasgow. So will they come to a conclusion?
They'll be going until Sunday night, Monday morning.
Yeah. So there's not so much to report from there yet, but I'd also like to broaden the conversation a little bit further into offsetting, because basically what the Paris Target Agreement and this Article 6 is about are the so-called compliance carbon credits. So for instance, in the European Union, there's this carbon cap and trading system, which basically through which the EU says to certain industries that you're only allowed to emit this and this much, and the carbon emissions for those sectors, for those companies are effectively capped. So this is a so-called compliance market. But what we also see trending heavily are the voluntary carbon markets, right? And what's to be noted here is that if you generate like a carbon credit for the compliance markets, then, to avoid double accounting, it can only be placed there and not in the voluntary markets, right? But here's really the thing about this. Now, it has been shown that those compliance markets where they effectively cap the emissions, well, that is a somewhat effective mechanism to actually reduce emissions. It depends often on the price that the companies need to pay, and sometimes in the past there have been some perverse effects of those prices being too cheap. But for instance, in Europe now, 60 euros per ton of carbon, it's a decent price, right? But what's happening now in the real world is that businesses are increasingly, especially the high emitting ones that serve consumers, are asking us to offset, right, with voluntary carbon credits. So this could be your Shell saying, hey, try carbon free because carbon neutrally, because we have this forestry project here and we're offsetting your emissions, right? But the thing here is, and I'd really like everyone to know this, is that there aren't enough carbon credits and carbon offsetting projects to support business as usual.
Yeah,
like we're putting over 40 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere every year and growing, right? And if you look at the projects and the technologies and the practical means that we have today, and also lean forward a little bit in thinking, okay, what might be possible in the next years? Then, if you listen to the scientists, they're saying that by 2050, on an annual basis, we might be able to offset 20 gigatons. And that's the very, very most optimistic scenario, under the most favorable conditions. So the notion of saying, hey, let's just keep going, business as usual, we just offset, keep flying, whatever, that is wrong. Yeah, and I really want everyone to know that and to reject
such an important
point.
But do offset what you're doing now, but just don't.
Offsets are good now. Yes.
Yeah. But don't believe that that's going to solve the problem, right?
Exactly.
That's the important thing. But Joe, I mean, Singapore is building building a lot on this whole Article 6.
The climate impact exchange. Voluntary.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
voluntary
and Joe, I know
credits.
you've been working with some people on this recently. Do you want to jump in? I know. I mean, it's not about criticising governments or anything.
No. I mean, if you look at these carbon credit projects, these are also very important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, support afforestation, so plant more trees, or, for instance, support the farmers, the 500 million smallholder farmers in adopting more carbon smart practices. We have to do this, but this should not be at the back of justifying business as usual. Right? That's
for
my
Monsanto.
point. Yeah. Sorry, Robert?
For Monsanto, business as usual for Monsanto. Put the pressure on the small farmer, Monsanto can keep doing what they need to do.
But I'm not sure if we want to jump into the agricultural discussion already, but this actually...
No, I was just going to ask Joe if he wanted to jump on this, because I know he's been doing some work with some people in this space, so...
Yeah, so I was helping produce a webinar for Cyberdyne Tech Exchange, and they're responsible for setting up basically an exchange where what they hope to do is to address some of these things that we talked about. How do you keep track, make sure there's no double counting, and you get the real cost of everything. So they're actually setting up an exchange that is going to have you require, even both as investor as well as seller, to declare the real costs of what your asset is, right? So that would include all asset classes, and amongst the things you'd be able to trade on the exchange would be Bitcoin, for instance. And for them, they attach 170 tons of carbon cost to one Bitcoin. At least that's what it's trying to make you aware of. Everything has a cost, so that it's all kinds of assets will be traded with those kind of costs built in, or at least calculated and taken into account. So it does. They're trying to find a financial and technological solution to making the accountability part of it at least something that you can rely on, so that there's less doubt about whether or not this is a fair calculation. I think part of it also is that they're relying on market forces, because I think, as we talk about how the voting public, the profile of the voting public is changing as well, the buying public is changing as well, the investing public is changing as well, and people do have questions. What they want to, for instance, is the idea of like we in diamonds, you have blood diamonds. There's an idea that you can actually have more sustainably farmed, more sustainably mined cryptocurrency, for instance, right? Because of the way you can track where things were made and how the blockchain tracks how things were made. The idea is that you would one day be able to say, I want to buy Bitcoins, but I don't want to buy just any Bitcoin. I only want to buy Bitcoins that have been produced in a way that I agree with. So it's a complicated thing, but they want to create this market mechanism that allows for these kinds of choices to be made. And I think it's rather interesting that they're getting. It makes it something that is tangible to maybe accountants, because accountants don't necessarily think in terms of trees and what have you. But if you can digitize all these assets and these things in some way that becomes a meaningful number to those people who are just looking at numbers, you potentially have a means of pulling some levers.
But by the way, Joe, you actually raised a good point about accountants and their role, and that really needs to shift as well. Some organizations, NGOs, have actually looked at what kind of annual reports, the Big Fours and also other auditors have signed off. And the number was something like that in 70% of the annual reports signed off by auditors, climate aspects were completely missing. You know, and the point here is that climate risks are material for pretty much any business. So that's why we have the whole auditing industry kind of on their tiptoes now, as to quite a big change is coming their way, because they can no longer continue signing off these balance sheets and ignoring climate risk, which is what they have been doing. But obviously, the industry needs to build up a lot of competence and capacity to do so. And many industries need to do so. My other favorite topic, the lack of climate misinformation policy on LinkedIn. You know, you report someone for obvious misinformation, and they take no action because they have no policy, nor the the people to police it. Yeah, same goes for auditing in the financial sector.
Well, you can certainly see
in general.
Yeah, the content that's being released by all of the big consulting firms. I flagged a number of them and said you can't put reports out like this unless you put the climate impact that you're talking about. You know, come on, guys. You know, you talk about, you know, the luxury brands in China and the rise of it. At what cost to the environment? Like, talk about that. You know, we've got Black Friday coming up. People are talking about it on LinkedIn. Everyone will talk about, oh, it's a record-breaking year. Wasn't this fantastic? At what cost to the environment? When, you know, it's not part of, you know, it's sometimes I feel it's like it's so disjointed being in the world at the moment. You go onto LinkedIn and people are talking business as usual, and I'm like, can you not see what's going on here? You know, I find it's jarring, right?
But that's what it is. We have hard-baked in structures in place for the world as it is today, and how business works and how governments work and how people work. And we're trying to squeeze in all these elements, what you guys have been talking about. It's like a 3-card Monty game that we're trying to do here. Money here, but it's over here, move it over there. Where's the money gone? It just feels like keep everything running as it is, but let's try and squeeze all this stuff in, stuff it in somehow, and see if we can sort of make this look like it's supposed to look.
Yeah.
And I think I go back to, and I think that's something needs to happen to make this just break.
Until people sort of wake up and say, "Whoa, we've got a bit of a problem here. Business as usual isn't the solution. We need to
What's the thing that's going to make people wake up?"
And a lot of people aren't, right? Sorry, Mark.
I was going to say, I think that's a really critical point. The fact that the scale of change is actually significant. Right. And everything needs to change. To move to a net zero emission circular economy is really profound. It's a complete turnover of the way we've done things for, centuries. Well, a century, perhaps, at least since the Industrial Revolution in any case. And to turn all that around is challenging, and it needs all of business and all of government and governments and all of civil society all sort of pulling in the one direction and realizing perhaps that things can't go on sort of the way they have. And this is, you know, something I alluded to earlier, perhaps, you know, something like GDP, which is a measure of output. It's a measure of what are we creating, right? And it's a classic indicator of the linear economy because it's measuring what comes out the back end, right? Is that really the right measure?
No, it isn't.
How
No,
we
it isn't.
sort of
Well,
No, it isn't.
it's a rhetorical
we know,
question,
right? But you know, but in order for us to get there, one of the biggest things is, when we said it earlier, truth, trust, transparency, and that's something I'm really passionate about. And you know, like Robert, you were talking about being cynical. Please don't get lost in cynicism, because when you get lost in cynicism, you lose all hope, and we can't go there, right? But you know, it's very difficult. So one of the pieces of news that came out this week is from a data perspective. So the Washington Post published a report on emissions reporting. I don't know if any of you guys had a chance to read it. I can't remember who shared that one, but yeah, you did, right? Okay, you know, and basically it examined 196 countries, and there's a huge gap between the declarations of emissions versus the reality. So basically they're saying there's between 8.5 and 13.3 billion tons of underreported emissions, which basically can have a significant impact on how fast the Earth warms. So the 2.8, 3.7, 1.8, 1.5, whatever everyone's saying, there's this other aspect that's not even factored in. And Susanna, you said it was we released 40 billion tonnes, so I had 33 billion tonnes. But either way, 13.3 billion tonnes. Well, there you go. Okay. Well, yeah, but 13.3 billion on top of that's a lot of tonnes, right? But if we can't trust, it has to be the countries that are reporting this information, the businesses, we just need to put it all out there on the table. Because if we don't know what we're dealing with, we're not going to be able to do it. We're not going to be able to solve the problem, right?
So some of this actually, I'm not going to say the issue goes away, but some of it is changed with the Paris Agreement rulebook. So previously under Kyoto, you had the Annex 1 countries, so basically the developed world, have to submit their yearly set of numbers. In general, they're sort of done bottom up, right? So, there's a scheme here in Australia where industries, large emitting industries, all have to report to the government. Government totals them all up, makes all the adjustments for agricultural land use change and stuff, and then submits that. It's a pretty robust process. In fact, of all the things, the Australian government greenhouse gas reporting scheme is world class. It's so good, right?
Good.
I've been working in it for a long
thing.
time. So well done Australia. Well done Malcolm Turnbull. He brought that in, right? In 2008, 2007. Sorry. So anyway, that's what did happen. But developing countries, because we acknowledged that there was time taken and to learn these things, knowledge transfer required, technology required, etc. We're required to do either a national communication or a biennial update report under Kyoto, and they were done infrequently, right? So there's a few countries that do them really well and have done them every couple of years. Singapore is one of those. They're very proud of the work that they're doing in this, and they're quite good reports. But other ones have done maybe one, right? Yeah. Since 95 or something. And so there's a lot of differences now. Under the Paris Agreement, it sets a common reporting guidance, right? And says every country, your developing country, your developed country, doesn't matter. Every country has to submit a communications report every year, right? And that should sort of increase the amount of transparency around reporting. However, I'm not sure that everyone is all countries are in that place just yet to be able to do things. Not all countries have got a sort of compliance reporting scheme within them. And there will be, I think, a little bit of variation here and there between how the countries report. I actually did a presentation a couple of months ago, and it was called "When is a ton not a ton?" Right? Because a ton is a mass unit. So a ton should be a ton in every case. That's, I'm an engineer. We love mass units because they don't change. But in the world of greenhouse gases, they do change because it depends on what factor I'm using. It depends on which, global warming potential I'm using. It depends on all these things. And we need to sort that out because, one, we need our baseline correct. And two, I need to know that if I've purchased a ton of abatement in Vietnam, that is actually the same as the ton that I emit here in Australia, right? And right now that's not the case because their ton is a different ton, right? And it's just really, really difficult. So kudos to the Washington Post, though.
Yeah, but such a great example of, the challenges that we face, right, in overcoming this, and why so many people are sitting there going, I don't know how to make any sense of this, right? Because they're right that they can't make any sense of this. But another issue. Sorry, Robert, go.
I was going to say, but are we losing ourselves in the miasma of detail around these topics? I think by now we all know the things that cause the problems. We all have an idea of what we need to do to fix these things.
Let's not get stuck.
As opposed to getting lost in how do we report this, and we have years of debates around, well, I want to measure it this way, but my country needs to measure it this way because I don't have that industry, I've got this industry. We get lost in that discussion as opposed to, we know we're doing this. It's just fine.
And exactly. And we shouldn't be having the discussion about the minutiae whilst then not bothering with the game, which is actually reducing those. It doesn't matter what number you start from, as long as you number one, end up at zero by the middle of the century, and number two, start removing CO2 from the atmosphere afterwards. And I feel
And
like
actually,
that's a bit that's not being talked about as much, the negative part.
yeah, and actually, if you look at the strategies and tactics used by the fossil fuel industry in particular to continue business as usual, which have been studied by academics and others recently, and also there are quite some interesting studies now. But what they say is the fossil fuel industry, I mean, denying climate change is like so passé, but delay is the tactic. And I wouldn't be surprised if they were heavily present in this, whatever bodies they are, to determine the right metrics and sources and whatnot to distract us from the main agenda, right?
Yeah, and exactly. Keep your eyes open for that, right? But here's another issue, big issue around the climate crisis. And Robert, I'm sure you're going to be interested in this. So equality. And that's another big topic this week. So there's two aspects that sort of jumped out to me. And this is a topic I'm passionate about for many, many reasons. But basically, climate change in and of itself exacerbates inequality. And and it could push an additional 63 to 135 million people into poverty by 2030. And we've already seen a massive shift of people moving into poverty just in the last 2 years with the pandemic, right? But so one of the examples is carbon pricing. So basically, it will be imposed on businesses and then consumers that they have to pay more for their product to curb greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, for the world's poorest people who have to spend a significant portion of their income on energy, that's something that they can't bear. So we've started to see some revolts around the world. I mean, even in France a couple of years ago when they tried to put some carbon pricing on petrol, there were revolts, right? So there's that. So the people who didn't cause the climate crisis are being screwed over again. But on the other side, from the female perspective, women and girls are more impacted and suffer disproportionately the impacts of the climate crisis. They think, what is it? 80% of those who are displaced by the climate crisis so far are women. And this year, 2021, 4 million girls won't be able to complete their education, but they think it's going to increase to 12.5 million girls not completing their education a year. And we all know that education is the key to get out of poverty, right? So, but there's been some gender justice announcements. So basically, it will be a guiding principle for all funding. So Germany, Canada, the UK, and other countries. So the issue around equality, and that's diversity to me as well, but the issue around equality, especially when it comes to females, is that everyone thinks it's a women's issue. Okay, equality is not a women's issue. Equality is a human issue. Everyone benefits from equality. Men have more opportunity, have greater lives. They can do different things. They don't have to be the breadwinners. They can go and choose other paths because their wives can do that. But everyone wins from equality. GDP. I know it's not a good thing, but it does go up. Businesses are more profitable. So we've gone backwards with inequality in the last few years, significantly backwards. The pandemic has been disastrous for women, and climate change is another crisis on top. We don't have women sitting in the decision making the decisions in the negotiations, not in enough represented. 50-50 it should have been. So, I mean, to me, equality is one of these issues that my heart is aching. I was like, how do we fix this? Because Robert, what you were saying right at the beginning, for people in Africa, for people in the developing country, people are suffering. They're suffering, and I don't know if you guys have you seen the Belarus border where the refugees have basically been locked out. The Polish aren't letting them in. I mean, the number of climate refugees that we need to be getting ready for is going to be astronomical, and we're not ready. We can't deal with what we've got. It creates so much friction in the world. We've got to address this as an absolute central priority. So I don't know if you guys have got any thoughts.
Well, I read an article just the other day. I can't remember where I was. It was probably in The Guardian, but it was actually an article about this lady who her family had been washed out of their home in Bangladesh, right? So a flood one year, and then they do some rebuilding, and then there's another flood, and then they're like, that's it, I can't stay here, right? And they were sort of living off the land. It was a subsistence life, but they were happy, and she had a house and all this stuff. So she moved to Dhaka and has ended up in a slum with no job, finding it hard to get work and finding it hard to have an existence within the city, right? And that's a very real example of what's happening. And then what happens when Dhaka starts flooding? Right, because it's pretty low lying, and then all of these Bangladeshi people, where are they going to go, and how are they going to get there, and what tensions does that then create on borders and things? And
there's already a bunch of people from Myanmar sitting in Bangladesh, right? The Rohingya,
and it's a really tough challenge, and I don't know, it needs sort of regional solutions or global solutions at sort of a regional leadership or UN level or something like that. I don't know the answer, right? But I can tell you it's going to happen more.
But the first answer is keep the fossil fuels in the ground and change the global economy so it's not a growth economy, so we stop making it a worse problem. We need to prepare for the climate refugee, so I think we should be building refugee cities and infrastructure all around the world in places we know it's going to be safe. So when the floods come to Dhaka, people can at least pick up and move with dignity to a place where they can settle before we can work out what's next, right? Because rather than being sold into slavery or sexual slavery, all the other awful stuff or drowned in the oceans or freezing in Europe. I mean, how many years have some of those people have been sitting there freezing in Europe? I mean, you think of 50% of the refugees are children. The majority of them are women. I mean, I know people don't like to talk about it, but, sitting in a freezing camp with no toilet facilities, just dealing with menstruation, giving birth, it's just to me, it's just like we as a global society should solve this problem, and we need to prepare for it because it's going to be bigger. And if we don't prepare for it, it's going to create war. Yeah. And it's going to, be that depravity that the Mexican Prime Minister was talking about. So we just got to do it. And, it'll create jobs. Building this infrastructure will create jobs. But, human dignity at the centre, it's like we just don't care. We're putting walls around our countries like what, the climate crisis is going to stay out?
And it's not to be repetitive, but it's an example of how interconnected we are as countries, and in all the issues that go within a country. Everything is so interconnected now across the globe. And to be fair to the people in positions that have to make these decisions, they're only human. You can't think of just climate change on its own and then, right, I've got 10 o'clock now, I'm going to talk about whatever it might be. Or I've got 12 o'clock, I'm talking about, they're all connected. You somehow have to draw that picture out, that web, and make decisions based on the web as opposed to this little silo with its repercussions. What's it going to do to my party, to my position in power, whatever it might be. And it goes back to a fundamental change needs to happen in terms of how we live, how we're governed, how we have countries and borders, and what's it going to take to get that change to actually trigger off. And I don't think we're there yet, Andrea. I'm sorry. I don't think
we're not.
We're not the trigger point yet.
No, that bigger change. Yeah, I agree. I think we're past the tipping point of awareness that the climate crisis is an issue we need to be paying attention to. But that bigger step up to understanding what the centre, it's about changing. What we've built for the last 150 years is not good. Like when we're all running around in a circle, we're all consuming bullshit, basically. We've got advertising breaking up any of our video experiences, trying to sell us crap we don't want to buy. And we're just accepting this. We wear Fitbits technology on our arm to measure our steps because we don't know that we've been sitting down for too long. We're just buying into this sort of world, and it's actually not making anyone happy. But I think the pandemic's been fantastic from that perspective because people are saying, "Wait a minute, I'm not happy," and there's this big resignation. But it's actually not. It's not about resigning. It's about saying, "I don't want this anymore." So I actually do think we have an opportunity to help shift. I mean, Robert, you see what I'm doing. That's that's the message. I'm like, come on, guys, let's move in this direction. You know, it's.
Yeah, I understand.
But we need all of us to do it, right?
And to come back to Mark and point, I think Mark, proof of work in Bitcoin for me can fix this. And I've fallen down this rabbit hole since September. And I'm doing a lot of reading, listening to a lot of podcasts and all the rest of it. And it'll be a fundamental change adopting Bitcoin globally. I think it needs to happen because it drives a completely different way of being, living, thinking about money, wealth, and value. And it's worth it. It's worth spending some time just exploring the topic, Andrea, and just really trying to understand what's behind it and go beyond you have to definitely get beyond the price goes up, price goes down. That's a really small element of what Bitcoin's all about. It's all the other elements behind it, the philosophy, the history of money, the evolution of money globally. All the things we're talking about will require governments to print money, which is great. Print money, central banks will do that, spread it all around all over the place. But what does that actually do in terms of inflation and impacts to real people and developing nations and people who are poor when the currency is being debased and there's nothing else to hold the value of what they need to do? They need to buy food, places to live, but they can't afford it anymore because what's happening with the money printers. So there's a lot more behind Bitcoin, and it's different from cryptocurrencies. Put those aside. Bitcoin is a separate entity outside of the whole cryptocurrency environment, NFTs and all that sort of rubbish.
All right, Robert, I'm going to book you in for a podcast where you can convince me.
I know. I'll listen.
I'm still learning. I'm still learning. There's a lot more behind it than just money.
I'm certainly a big fan about the underlying technology. So, I think distributed ledger and having transparency in something like supply chains, or transparency in emissions or offsets, whatever. I don't care what it is. That's I think key. I probably do need to learn a lot more about Bitcoin myself.
Because everything we're talking about today, the base layer of everything we're talking about today is money, our fiat currencies. Something has to happen with money. It needs to be spread, redistributed, printed, so more people can have it. That's the base layer. And that's what Bitcoin talks about, that base layer. And how do you establish? Definitely something for you to go investigate, look into, and try and understand better. Yeah.
That's a good insight. All right, so let's move on to agriculture. So this isn't one of the topics that I would necessarily pay a lot of attention to, but one of the things that I think has happened, Cop26, is that big agriculture seem to be playing a bit of a game of keep our heads down and maybe nobody's going to notice what we're doing. And I just wanted to see, Susanna, I know this is a big passion topic for you. You probably paid a lot more attention. What are you hearing from a big agriculture perspective?
Actually, there hasn't been so much I've heard from COP regarding agriculture, and I've even had to go down and search, so it's not really coming through in the mainstream media. But actually, there have been 45 governments that have again pledged urgent action, climate action through agriculture by implementing more sustainable ways of farming. And what I actually think is good news that throughout this COP26 process, 26 nations have kind of sharpened their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, around agriculture. So I think that is actually positive. And these 26 nations that have sharpened those commitments include India, Vietnam, and Australia, and even Brazil, although I'm a little bit skeptical about that. Talking about the private sector, about 100 high-profile companies have also made a commitment to become nature positive by 2030. I haven't really heard a lot about this. It seems to me that maybe some details are still being worked out, but I would think that by next week we should hear more about these topics. But what I want to highlight here is the relevance of this topic. So earlier we talked about the 73% of emissions that come from the energy sector. Well, the agriculture, forestry, and land use contributes to the rest, 23% roughly. numbers sometimes differ here a bit. I've also had 27% for agriculture, forestry, and land use, the AFOLU term, if you like. And again, what I would like everyone to know is that unfortunately we have this kind of double whammy effect happening right now. So if we take 27% out of total greenhouse gas emissions as the baseline for this sector, which some reports use, so 7% of those emissions come from changes in land use and forestry. So this is basically deforestation, or the forests burning, or Australia burning, right? Yeah. So 7% of all global greenhouse gas emissions come from changes like that, or the peatlands that are being cleared for palm oil cultivation in Southeast Asia, right? Then the 20%, the other 20%, the bulk of that actually comes from cattle farming, right? So when we clear forest and then put cattle there, this is really the very negative spiral that's happening. So by clearing the forest, we lose carbon sinks, we lose a lot of carbon into the air. And once we then put cattle there, we keep emitting methane, right? Mm. So this is really the thing I want everyone to be aware of. It's really quite significant. Yeah. So out of the 40 plus gigatons that we put into the air, cattle farming is 8 gigatons, right? So it's quite significant as an output, right?
Yeah.
And,
so no need red meat.
Yeah. There are, of course, some methods that can reduce the carbon footprint and the greenhouse gas footprint of keeping cattle, the more traditional ways of grazing and so on. But, we as consumers on the demand side really can influence this. Yeah. And then the other big topic, particularly relevant here in Asia, especially is rice. Yeah. So rice cultivation creates about 2 gigatons of emissions per year. Yet obviously rice is the staple food here. And I'm not asking anyone to, stop eating rice. But again, this comes to the financial topic. There are agricultural methods through which the emissions in rice growing and growing crops in general can also be significantly decreased. But this requires investment. This requires education, because farmers need to do certain things differently, which costs more money in the short term. Yeah, but definitely the payback is there. And academics have calculated that to kind of reform, for instance, the Mekong river delta, to help farmers farm rice there more sustainably, hundreds of millions of dollars of investment would be needed. This would require, the rice field, the paddies, to be more laser leveled actually, so that they can retain water better. And by managing water better, there's less organic material in the soils that's rotting and releasing methane. And there are also many other agricultural practices also for other crops that will help to avoid emissions or to put more carbon back into the soil. So we have these solutions, these techniques, these practices are known. It's just that, especially the smallholder farmers of the world, 350 million of them here in Asia, don't necessarily know how to apply them or don't have the financial means to implement them. Yeah. And just looking back to the topic of carbon credits, there are also increasingly companies that are working with farmers to help them to adopt these practices. And the revenues from the carbon credits would then go and finance this. But it's not an easy journey. And therefore, I'm saying there's potentially something good coming out of these voluntary carbon credits, especially in the context of agriculture, helping farmers. And, rice farmers are really the poorest farmers of them all. They really live at poverty or poverty line. So if we can help them to grow more sustainably, increase their incomes, this has also lots of positive social and economic benefits for them. So this is something very, very important. So keep paying attention to what comes out of the COP26 agricultural commitments and policies. This is very important.
Yeah, but also taking care of the farmers. I was up in the Mekong last year, almost 15 months ago, and it's magnificent up there. It's so beautiful. But one of the biggest issues in this area is water management, and it's an issue in many countries, right? And so it's not that there's not enough water; it's that the water is being managed badly. We've seen it in Iran, Lebanon. We're seeing it in a lot of the Stan countries. So basically, if they solve the water management issue, that will help a lot, especially as far as famine and floods and droughts and everything that's going on, right?
And emissions as well.
Yeah, exactly. But the other thing that was because
sorry, Andrea, just I need to interrupt, and I need to take to leave. I need to go and help my wife get to the hospital for something. So I really would like to spend more time here and would love to, but I wanted to leave, if I can, one little idea. Like with I've been watching COVID and the way we're dealing with COVID, and it has something to do with the environment, right? There are lots of solutions that kind of would work if we only put enough investment into it. And I think the solutions that we have for the environment, they're all there as well. There are a lot of things that could work and should work right now. But as we've seen in COVID, unless there is a kind of a buck to be made, there's not going to be as much research and development going into something unless there's a kind of a payout or something where the investments can pay off financially. So the job, I think, is to try and figure out these things, like the ideas, like we talk about what's good for the environment, what could work for the environment. We also have to figure out the business around it. So we go like, okay, so there are these things that we could do, but there's no interest in doing it because people aren't going to make a lot of money of it. So how do we figure out these other ways, these newer things that could actually work, where there is an incentive, and so there's more people going towards that particular solution? And I mean, it's creating a path of least resistance. Right now, the path is very hard to get through because in order to go in the right direction, a lot of people have to go through a lot of pain without an alternative. I think that's what we need to try and think about. And I'm really sorry that I can't stay to.
But just before you go, Joe, what you just said is exactly the problem. The idea that people need to make a buck to make a change. Right, so we need to transform the global economy, and that's going to mean we're going to have a different idea on what wealth is. That's the only way we can succeed. So that's my response to that. But take care of your wife.
Take care, everybody.
You, Joe.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Look, I'll leave the Mekong thing, but we're coming up to 2 hours, so let's wrap it up. But I just wanted to say there's some other just quick bits. So, Mark, you were talking about there were 24 countries and several car makers have committed to electric vehicles by 2040, which is awesome. 40 nations have pledged to cut emissions from their healthcare industries, which I actually, until I read that, I wasn't aware that was such a big contributor. There's some interesting research coming out around flying. Basically, if planes fly at a different level in the sky, and don't ask me to get technical because I can't, they will emit less, but also if we just small cuts in air traffic levels would help, but the industry can't grow bigger than it is today. That's basically the point. And so we need to cap planes until they can come up with a better solution. 1 billion people, another report, will suffer extreme heat at just 2 degrees Celsius global warming. So 1 billion people. So we were talking about the climate refugees. One of the things that I'm really excited to see, I've been blogging about this for a number of years, and some of my blogs get 30 views, right? But apparently the advertising and marketing sector is getting a really, really big pushback on supporting fossil fuel, automotive, airline industries. So that's been a really good change. And then probably the thing that probably annoyed me the most and sort of upset me the most is there was a survey of 10 countries where basically the people have said they are not, or very few people are willing to change their lifestyle to save the planet. And I think that's a thing that we need to address, because I'm sure you guys feel it as well. If you change how you live yourself, it gives you a bigger commitment. Like, you can't walk into an environment where you can see people with balloons and go, oh yeah, you got balloons. You just think single-use plastic. Or if people have got plastic bottles of water, you're like, why didn't you bring your own bottle? You just go into a bigger way of thinking about how gently you walk on the earth, right? But the majority of people aren't there yet. So I think it's a job we've got to do. But yeah, so it was billed as the last best hope. What do you think?
Cop27's in Egypt. That's been announced.
It'll probably be too hot by then.
Well, it's next year. But,
oh, okay. It should be. We might be all right.
Might be.
Yeah. Look, I think if countries come back with increased ambition next year, as has been asked, and actually have plans in place to achieve deep emissions cuts by 2030, which is the thing that's required, right? We need to be reducing emissions by some sort of 30-40% by that time, and we're not near that yet. That would be a nice outcome, but that's not going to come out of COP26. COP26, we've already seen the draft text. It's like, oh, we're going to do this thing next year, mañana, and it's very easy to do things next year. In the same way that, and this is, I feel this very deeply, it's very easy to set a 2050 net zero target because I'm not going to be there to implement it, right? Yeah. So
not my problem.
Yeah. And so someone said to me the other week, actually, they said, our company has a net zero target sort of off into the future, but we have a strong decarbonisation target within the next 5 years. And I know that's my responsibility to do because I will be the person in the firing line within that 5 years. That's what's actually required.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Susanna?
Yeah, for me, all these things, it just strengthens my resolute to keep doing what I'm doing and doing more and getting more people do the things we are doing. I think one can fairly say that this is a global leadership failure. At least with the leaders we are there. I mean, some positive advances, but by and large, not what one would expect and hope for. So we just need to, I think, grow this movement bottom up, and help more people understand the severity of the situation, and but to be inclusive on that journey. I mean, I won't waste my time on climate change deniers, but there are lots of other people who are kind of at the verge of starting to address these issues, not just in their personal lives, but professionally. I think the professionals are really now, tasked to start thinking about climate and sustainability as part of their job, and any job, I mean. So lots of people need to learn still a lot, need to understand the materiality of these topics in their professions, in their functions. A lot of work to be done. We cannot give up, but we need to get stronger.
Yeah. I've noticed recently, Susanna, you've attracted what I call the CO2 trolls. So the god of the CO2 trolls, I can't remember his name, but he's a former one of the Greenpeace early. He wasn't a leader of Greenpeace. He claims to have been one. I think you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, they keep quoting him at you. So and every now and again, I want to jump in and just basically take the piss out of them because it's so funny what they say. I mean, it's like a religion, these guys. But I think you handle yourself very well. But let's support each other. So Susanna shares so much information that I think that you're starting to attract these groups of people that will try and discredit you, and we need to be there to support you. But I notice you're not responding, and so therefore I'm not responding. But we all need to be taking care of each other in those situations.
And that is happening. So some weeks ago I posted something and I got some, not just very impolite, but very, very, unscientific responses. And, I don't usually go and, waste my time of, educating those people because they have a hidden agenda. But a lot of the people that follow me started to actually, engage with them and share more real facts, not alternative facts, but, evidence about, why what I was saying is kind of the, more accurate way of looking at things. So I'm very grateful for that kind of community support. I mean, I think there is the risk of kind of derailing precious time from the more productive conversations, and hence, I continue hitting the report button on LinkedIn in the hope that they will soon realize that they do need to have a misinformation policy on climate as they have on COVID.
Yeah.
So, that's something I could use everyone's help with as well, to make more people know that even LinkedIn is full of climate misinformation, and that LinkedIn is not taking any action against it presently.
Yeah. So just have you guys noticed in recent, it hasn't been going on for that long, but advertising pops up on your PC. Have you ever guys noticed that? So I just got a Black Friday advertisement pop up. So this is through it's not something I have any control over. I have to make the ads disappear. So you cannot escape advertising these days. It's everywhere you go. You see the futuristic movies with ads everywhere. Yeah. So Robert, you have hope.
Before that, I'll just come back on the point you made about 10% of people say they're not willing to change. I think that number.
No, it wasn't 10%.
Was it
much more? Yeah.
I think probably 10% said they want to change. Everybody else was staying the same.
Okay. So I'd expect it to be quite high, and I think that's outside of the money topic, which we've touched on. I think for me, that's a key element, that it needs to be driven by us, as opposed to some global body like the World Economic Forum coming in and saying, boom, here you go. If that happens, that's not a good situation. But to be positive, I'll leave with, at least we're talking about it, and we have been talking about it, and some things have happened along the road. It's better than nothing being talked about. Yeah. So I'll remain hopeful.
Yeah. No, it's good. No, look, I think all of us are realistic, as well as hope. We know that we've got to keep fighting, right? We've got to, because we've got to do it for our families, for our future, but there's days when you look at the reality and it's very bleak, right? What we face, but people who spend a lot of time invested in knowledge around the climate crisis are facing very bleak information. And then you read that the climate scientists are in tears because they're seeing it every day, right? And so they're even a deeper level of despair. But we've got to keep going, and we've got to keep going for them, to back them and help them believe that it's not too late, although many believe it is. But we've got to be part of it, And so many people I talk to, they just don't want to face it. It's too scary, and I'm like, well,
too big. You can't. It doesn't fit in your frame. It's too big. So what can I do? Yeah.
Yeah, but
that's the thing. You focus on what you can do. Yeah. You choose what you can do. There's a lot of things to be done, and then you focus on that, and then you do.
Yeah.
I think I would just say just on that, and this will be my last point, but there's some really good writing and studies done by Professor Stephen Lewandowski, who used to be at UWA and is now in the UK, all about the psychology of climate change and why people either find it really difficult to see it or turn to outright denial because it is just too big. If I accept this, that means I'm accepting my own mortality, even though it is a fact that you have to accept your own mortality at some point, right? But look up his work. It's really, really good.
Yeah, mortality is an interesting one. We don't seem to want to accept that, right? Okay, so we'll wrap up. I just want to say thank you so much for all of you and for being on this journey with me. I really appreciate it, Susanna, for the last couple of weeks. It's been great. It's such a wonderful opportunity for me to talk to other people who are like-minded, who care, who are passionate, and who seek the knowledge, who want to know, who want to find the answers as well. So I'm really grateful to you all for being here. But just before we finish, it's my son's 15th birthday today, and this is Lex, and Lex has had some pretty significant challenges on his journey, especially as a young little fella, and he just keeps overcoming, and he'll be doing things like the No Show one day because that's how his mind works. He's sort of curious about the entire world. But it's his it's his 15th birthday today, and he's our first fan, our first follower. He loves the fact that his mum's doing this. So happy birthday, my darling. I wanted to acknowledge that. But yeah, thanks, guys. I really appreciate you being here. We've missed a whole bunch of things that we usually do, but nice to meet you, Mark. Robert, nice to meet you virtually. We still haven't met in person, but more than LinkedIn. And Susanna, you're an absolute legend, and I'm here to support you always. So
thank you, and happy birthday.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks. Happy birthday, Lex.
All right. See you guys. Have a good weekend, everyone.
See you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.